I'm Heather Pemberton with Gartner Live. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm here with Mary Metalio, who's Vice President, Distinguished Analyst with our CIO Research Group. She's going to talk to us about methods for strong leadership and how to manage your workforce during disruption. We're trying a virtual LinkedIn Live this time. I'm in my home office in Connecticut, and Mary's in hers in Barcelona, Spain. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Heather. How are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing? And first, I want to check in on how everything's going over there. I know things have been really tough in Europe.
Yeah, things are tough in Europe. They're tough in Spain. We are in the thick of things. Hospitals are overloaded. We have an absolutely heroic healthcare staff working around the clock to try and treat patients. There's a lot of them, and we knew it was coming, and it's here. So it's rough. We're in full lockdown. So for those of us who aren't on the front line, what that means is that we're not allowed outside unless it's to buy essential groceries, medication, or take care of a dependent, or walk your dog if you have one. So I'm at home in my home office. We're not allowed to go outside to do sports or go for a run or even go for a walk. I live near the Mediterranean. I can hear it, but I can't see it and I can't go see it. So, I'm doing my bit by working from home and basically raiding my pantry every 20 minutes so that my weight gain is probably going to track the same exponential curve as coronavirus at this point. So we'll have to do something about that. There's probably going to be more of me to love when we're on the other side of that. But this is where we are right now.
It is. And thanks for your humor. I know we're all trying to do our best to manage this really difficult situation. Let's talk about what leaders are dealing with in their organizations. I know you're talking to IT leaders all day long and advising them on how to manage disruption, especially with their workforce. You talk about transformation before the crisis and in your standard research, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the program. But for now, what is on the minds of IT leaders and what are their priorities right now?
Yeah, so I would say the first wave of inquiry and questions we got, what do I need to do in order to make people able to work from home, thousands of people overnight. That has now given way to more questions that I'm fielding around, okay, so if we're in this for the long haul, how am I going to keep my team productive and cohesive and safe? How am I going to overcome feelings of isolation? How am I going to keep them motivated? Not next week, but like weeks from now. What are some practical tips for remote working? What can I do to make sure my team, especially newer employees, feel like they're part of something? So it's kind of recognition that this might not be a short-term tactical play, and a lot of questions around how can I keep my team cohesive and productive and motivated as we go through this.
Right. And I can imagine that leaders are now starting to think about this longer term. We've all started to realize the sprint that we were dealing with a couple of weeks ago has turned into a marathon. Is there particular guidance you're giving them around this longer term situation we're finding ourselves in?
Yeah. So I think leaders are getting overwhelmed with information from all sides. People are feeling frenzied information overload and media frenzy everywhere. I think there's a lot that I could say, but I would sort of boil it down to 4 areas, some of which are really obvious, but really leaders need to nail, and others that might not be so obvious. I think my overall observation is that in a crisis, leadership, both good and bad, is put into a crucible and exposed. And so it really matters. Good leadership and bad leadership really shows. So there's actions that leaders of any team, whether it's 5 people or 5,000 people, they can take to make sure their team remains safe and productive and cohesive.
Yeah. So we're going to take our viewer questions in a little bit, and thank you all for joining us, bearing with us during our first LinkedIn Live. If we have any technical challenges, we're going to hang in there. We hope you'll hang in there with us. Mary has a lot of useful information to share, so stick with us as we keep going. So Mary, let's continue with some of the actions that leaders can take to really focus their leadership during this time, because it's so important. I think everybody's been looking for that in a number of different realms as we try to deal with this situation. And what is some other guidance that you're giving?
So first of all, just an overall observation, not to put the pressure on, but if you lead a team of any size, the stakes are high because in a crisis, the imprinting of that crisis and the actions that are taken and the memories that are created are deeply imprinted on the brain, and they're encoded with emotion, which means that if the emotion was good when a leader did something really unexpectedly fabulous and fantastic in a crisis, people will remember that for a really long time. But the corresponding opposite is also true. So, what leaders do right now really matters because people will remember. This is a bit like if anyone listening has had a medical ailment, beyond or before COVID, where a doctor said something that was really unempathic. 25 years later, you're still going to remember that. And by the same token, a medical staff member that was really fantastic and did what you needed in the moment you most needed it, you'll remember that forever, decades later. And this is like that. So the stakes are high. One of the things that leaders really need to be doing is setting out a clearly prioritized list, a hierarchy of things that matter, and making that hyper clear and centrally mandated, but allowing for leaders at the edge to implement it with a high degree of local autonomy. Because in a crisis, you have to be able to make decisions really quickly. Not everybody has all the same information. And so it's really important that leaders at all levels of an enterprise understand what is most important. How are we going to prioritize and what are we going to prioritize? As opposed to like mediocre leadership that kind of puts everything at the same level. So you see this before COVID-19, you saw a lot of kind of buffet style leadership priorities, like we need to be high quality, secure, innovative, safe, efficient, agile, creative, digital. It just was this long laundry list with no prioritization. So no one would really know what was most important in that, right? So I think great leaders are being fantastic at putting together a hyper clear hierarchical list. It's first this, then this, then this. Maybe it's first employee safety, ethically interacting with our customers or whatever it is, just being hyper clear about what those priorities are and then allowing local leaders to implement them with a high degree of autonomy locally.
And what you're saying is that the direction that we're all looking for in this uncertain time is really essential in business. And as employees are looking for what is most important, leaders have an opportunity to set that clarity and establish it. And it's so important for keeping the business moving forward.
Yeah, they must do it. That's one thing. Another thing that I think leaders really need to be doing is what I would call non-binary problem solving, which sounds super academic and fancy. The opposite of that is what I would call like teenager problem solving. Okay, teenagers are famous for, and I know I did this, maybe some listeners did too, or viewers did too. Teenager problem solving tends to be very extreme and binary. I'm going to break up with him. I'm going to stay with him forever. I love school. I'm going to be, I'm going to go to the prom. I hate school. I'm going to drop out. I love my mom. I hate my mom. I'm going to run away, right? It's just this really binary way of approaching problems. And leaders are going to be faced and are being faced with really tough decisions, and it's useful to adopt explicitly a non-binary approach, such as maybe there's more options than just that we can do this or we either do this or we don't do this. We either stay together or we break up, right? There's many more options if you can just bring your creativity to bear on the problem. So for example, lots of leaders right now are struggling with layoffs. Businesses cannot go on paying their employees in the way that they have been if this crisis continues forever, especially small and medium businesses. But even large enterprise, there's only so much cash reserve you have on hand. And so one way to do this is you take off both of the extreme options. So you say, let's imagine we can't fully lay anybody off, and let's imagine we can't negatively affect our margins. What is left? And maybe this isn't always possible. It's absolutely not always possible. But maybe there's more options. Like, could we offer people 80%, working 4 days a week instead of 5, 80% of their salary, and then do that across 5 people and you get a full-time equivalent? Could we do that enough times that we don't have to absolutely lay someone off? Just one example. This isn't easy, but explicitly coming together as a leadership team and saying, we're going to do our utmost to generate more options and not be binary, not to sort of do a blanket cut, I think can really help.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really interesting, and it's a different way of thinking. So changing the mindset is so important at this time. I think we're all just catching up to what a paradigm shift this is psychologically to the way we're used to operating. What's another method or action you're suggesting?
Well, one that is absolutely dead obvious, but also really hard to achieve is super clear, empathic, honest communication. Clear, empathic, honest communication. Clear, empathic, honest communication. This sounds like a no-brainer. Like, who wouldn't say that, right? But it's quite hard to achieve when there's so much information coming at people, and often leaders, when they're trying to respond really quickly, can think in terms of like a communication plan. I have a colleague at Gartner who says it really shouldn't be called a communication plan. It should be called an understanding plan, because the point isn't so much that you communicated it, the point is that they understood it, right? And with everything shifting every day, 24 hours is a really long unit of time during COVID-19. And so with things shifting so rapidly, keeping the communications clear, honest, simple, clear, honest, simple can be quite difficult. And just thinking about it as, have they understood it, as opposed to did I communicate it, can really shift to what we need, which is for people to understand what's going on. Another super easy tactic is what I call the 10 by 10 by 10 rule, which is, if you're a leader, you might have to say things 10 times in 10 different ways for people to get 10%. Right? So if you're not going blue in the face saying the same thing over and over again, you might not be communicating enough. That is probably how you should be feeling. And honest empathy really matters. If you don't know, it might be better just to say, we don't know, but we're getting an answer. Or as far as we know, this isn't changing in the next week. Empathic responses really matter. As I was using the analogy before of a medical analogy, an empathic health worker versus an unempathic one. People remember that for a long time. So just making sure that the communication is really empathic. I think most enterprises are doing that quite well, frankly. So that part's really good. But just honest, simple, clear communication over and over again.
I just want to diverge for a minute to say that some of these techniques, and we're seeing this across businesses, the understanding plan, the 10 by 10 by 10, those sound like techniques we can take on and keep moving forward with as good communication principles, even outside of a pandemic crisis, and that maybe leaders will then start to instill them in their behavior.
Everything I've just said is stuff you could be using at any point. But the reason that crises are such a crucible for good and bad leadership is because crises amplify what is already there. And thus, any of these practices can and should be used in peacetime, so to speak. But whether or not you use them, the results will be amplified. You know, how you behave right now and the importance of using those right now is amplified beyond, say, peacetime measures. But absolutely, this is stuff that can and should be used way beyond the next 8 weeks or 6 months or whatever this ends up being. Absolutely. There's a final thing that I would recommend leaders do, which is across enterprises, across neighborhoods, across communities, people are going above and beyond. They're doing heroic acts, whether it's something relatively small, like offering to do the shopping for your 70-year-old neighbor, or something much bigger, like showing up every day as a healthcare worker in your community and putting your life on the line and that of your family because you have to, and your sense of duty compels you to do that. People all across communities, neighborhoods, businesses are really acting heroically. And one thing leaders can do is they can capture those stories. They're happening within enterprises all over the place. And so, if you have a story about Rosa and Sandeep being up till 4 a.m, figuring out the VPN solution, and between the two of them, they drank 17 cups of coffee each in their home office, right? You want to capture that. And I mean the detail of that story, not like a distilled PowerPoint slide with bullet points saying, 75% of our workers were working remotely within 48 hours. Like, that's fine. But the detail of the stories is what creates the team cohesion that will last way beyond this if you get it right. This is what I mean about making the stakes really high. This stuff is happening. People are being heroic in small ways and big ways. And one of the things leaders can do is just collect those stories with all of the detail and tell them over time, because the acuteness of this crisis is going to go away, and then we're going to be in a chronic phase that creates a lot of fatigue. I predict there's going to be a little bit of crisis fatigue where it just kind of gets old and the alertness that we feel right now will go away. And the skills needed for acute are not the same as the skills needed for chronic. And so a lot of the questions I'm fielding from leaders is they're seeing this. How down the line am I going to keep the motivation up? This is one of the ways. Can you collect the stories and tell them, hey, we are these people. This is our identity. This is who we are. That kind of social cohesion or team cohesion, you cannot buy that. You cannot buy that. So this is one of the great sort of finally a little silver lining that you can get from a crisis that you probably could not get in peacetime. So don't let all of those stories just go off into the ether. Try to collect them so that you can tell those stories and create that identity and cohesion.
And it builds culture. I want to bridge to the work you do outside of this pandemic situation on culture and how important culture is to transformation and getting it right. What do you see as a thread here for how this will impact culture moving forward?
Yeah, so before COVID-19, I would say one of the top 5 questions I got was talking to digital transformation leaders or cultural change agents or change leaders in organizations. They would ask me, Mary, how can I get people to pay attention and care about this transformation? They almost felt like Cassandra from Greek mythology, who was given the gift of prophecy, like she could tell the future, but she was also cursed with the fact that no one would believe her. So these transformation agents and culture change agents were going, we have to change, and disruption is coming, and technology is changing at the most rapid pace in human history. We have to change, right? Why is no one listening to me? So they didn't have the urgency, and people were kind of going about their daily business. What the crisis does is create that urgency for you. So I think what's going to happen, especially with digital transformation in a lot of areas, especially around digital ways of working, as we're seeing, we're doing this from our home offices, right? That is going to get a huge amount of acceleration, and people will suddenly and overnight change, right? They will be motivated to change, and the urgency is kind of there on a platter. So that will, I think, accelerate. What might not is organizations who were supposedly digitally transforming, but really they were just dabbling. They were just dabbling, maybe had a little AI tech on the side, or we're doing sort of observation of what blockchain might do, but they were just dabbling on the edges without any really serious commitment. I think that might not make it through this kind of crisis, but certainly fundamental transformation intent in a lot of digital areas, especially ways of working, I think has just gotten a major accelerator as a result of this, and thus the culture that is created around it will change at max speed. Before any of this happened, I used to say, and I still would say, humans are not bad at change. Like there's this myth out there that humans are really, really terrible at change. Humans are not bad at change. They're bad at change that they don't care about, that they're not motivated by. But if anyone anyone viewing this has ever had a child, just think back to your first baby, 24 hours before you have it, you're maybe like sipping a martini on the beach and chilling out. I don't mean 24 hours, but you're having this life where you have your own time and your spare time and you're choosing which restaurant to go to, and then you have this baby to take care of, and 24 hours later you have no life, you don't sleep, you don't eat, you don't know what's going on, your whole life is overturned. And yet mostly human beings navigate that, not gracefully, but we're capable of that change kind of in the blink of an eye, and that's being demonstrated right here with COVID-19.
Right.
People are able to do great change in the blink of an eye if the motivation is there.
Right. Just another question before we get to audience questions. And if you have a question for Mary about your own leadership, organizational disruption, now's your chance to ask it. Mary, as you look at, and I know it's probably a little premature to ask this, but as organizations are thinking about their own transformation, do we have a sense yet of how they're adapting those to this current situation? Because there is a lot of, in some respects, digital transformation would move forward more aggressively and more urgently because we're doing more digitally. We certainly see that with the digital workplace and digital dexterity. We have some research coming out that, those organizations that had a more digitally dexterous workforce were certainly in a better position to manage this. But as far as digital transformation, can you sense anything based on some of the conversations you've had with clients with where they are in that respect?
I think in general, leadership teams, so not just IT leaders, in general, executive leadership teams, everybody is throwing out their old strategy and re-examining it fundamentally in light of this. So they are not using traditional decision-making models, and they are not using traditional data. They're sort of like a pre-COVID moment and a post-COVID moment. And so every executive leadership team is re-examining the fundamentals of their strategy, their business model, their transformation, and what they want to be. And it's incumbent upon every leader to do that because this is a major inflection point. What is that going to lead to? There's a lot of hypothesis-driven decision-making going on, so less about evidence base. This is where we were because, of course, projections that were linear have been thrown out the window based on COVID-19, but more hypothesis-driven. A lot of leaders are doing scenario planning to try and determine in this world of uncertainty what they might do if different scenarios were brought to bear. So maybe they're varying the time frame. So how long might this last? And thus what might we do in a situation where it lasts a really long time or a medium amount of time or a short time, it's just a dip. So a lot of scenario planning going on to try and mitigate the uncertainty. But in general, I would say every leadership team is re-examining the fundamentals of what they do. And a lot of them are going back to really basic core competency, who are we and who do we want to be? And what do we need to focus on? Crises have a tendency to be a massive focusing mechanism. So this is, pre-COVID-19, I would exhort leadership teams to please not use corporate speak when they were trying to get their people to change. Pre-COVID-19, you might hear someone talk about a digital transformation, like their vision might be, we aim to be a digital-first organization ready for the challenges of the 21st century, exploiting our ecosystem of partners in order to deliver agile, customer-centric innovations everywhere, blah, 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 right? And that's just never going to make anybody's heart beat faster. But now, with the crisis, I think it's a real focusing tool. So a lot of executive leadership teams are stripping things back to bare bones. What do we really want to do? What's most important? And they're fundamentally being hierarchical, not in their management of people, but in their management of priorities. And that's exactly what they should be doing.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Okay, let's move to some audience questions. Our first one from Brian. How do you manage employees who are working in different areas of the world, all in different phases of the pandemic?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. Thank you, Brian. First of all, it's just really important to recognize that everybody is in a different phase. So I'm in Spain. My whole family lives in Canada, where I'm from. And I have been exhorting them for weeks now to please pay attention to what I'm saying and please do the social distancing, because in Canada, they were where we were a few weeks ago, where it just didn't feel that important. And I think one of the things to recognize is one of the fundamental psychological problems is this notion of cognitive dissonance, where cognitive dissonance is really fancy, there's a fancy definition, but essentially what I mean when I say that is where I technically understand what you're saying, I technically understand there's a need to change, but emotionally I'm just not there yet. So emotionally I just don't feel it. And if I look back to where we were a couple of weeks ago in Spain, we were told and exhorted by authorities to please, please, please do social distancing and please, not go out in big groups and not go out for dinner. And people kind of just ignored it, myself included, because it didn't feel emotionally like it was that urgent. There was no lion roaring in front of us saying, you must react now, you're being attacked. And our brains are not designed to react to a fundamentally invisible and silent and at first totally appears harmless kind of situation. There's no roaring lion. And so it's really important to recognize that everybody's in a different phase. People in parts of Asia Pacific, especially China, are coming out of this. Europe is in the eye of the storm. Parts of North America are just going into it. And so what that means is that you're probably a big part of your role is going to be to manage fear. And I think a leader can do a lot there to give your people tactics on how to manage fear. Essentially, what I've observed is there's two buckets of fear that people have. Fear number one, I'm afraid for my health and the health of my loved ones. And that could manifest in lots of ways. Is my father or mother going to die? My grandparent, can I get to them? What about this person who has a pre-existing condition? My kid has asthma, or just the second group of fear is economic. I'm fearful for my health and well-being and that of my loved ones, and I'm also fearful
Mhm.
for my financial future. So am I going to lose my house? Am I going to lose my job? Can I pay my mortgage? What about my partner's small business? They can't pay their people for more than 2 weeks. What do we do, right? And one of the jobs for leaders, wherever your people are, is to, I think, be quite proactive in managing that. And there's lots of tactics you can do to manage that fear. Part of it comes down to, I think, not just visualizing a positive outcome. I think it's a mistake to just rally around a positive visualization technique. I know there's a lot written about that, but I think it's useful. There's more and more written about visualizing the negative outcome too. If you want to increase people's resilience and increase their productivity at a point when fear might be paralyzing them to a greater or lesser degree, depending on where they are in the world, I think I think helping them visualize the negative outcomes and just disarm the fear by exploring it a little bit, giving it a name, defining what you would do to prevent that fear from coming true. Is there anything? Defining what you would do if it actually did come true. What could you do to repair it? Sometimes you can't repair it, but kind of gives people a sense of agency. Like, I'm not paralyzed by this nameless fear that's knocking around in the back of my head. There's stuff I can do. So there's tactics you can do to manage fear that are more proactive and give people a sense of agency, like they're not absolutely stripped of all power in this chaotic world we're in.
Right, which is so helpful. We have several more questions coming in. Let me move to Meredith. She asks, how can storytelling in comms be agile, authentic, and relevant as the world around us is changing so quickly? The story in August may need to be different or a progression from the story today to reflect, hopefully, the start of the business recovery phase. What are your thoughts?
So I think that that's absolutely right on. The stories are going to morph and change as we go through. So as I said earlier, the first thing is just make sure you're collecting stories somehow, some way. Okay, because even in August, if you're looking back to the heroic first days, people pulling all-nighters to get remote working solutions working, or the first time that they had to bring your pet to work, virtually, celebrating the fact that it's all kind of chaotic, right? Remembering those and telling those stories even months from now will be useful and will create that team cohesion. I do think there is going to be this fatigue problem that is likely to set in. If we're in for a long haul, what's going to happen is we're going to go from an acute phase to a chronic phase. And those require totally different skill sets. So there's people who, if you suddenly have an artery that's sliced open and blood is spurting everywhere, some people will faint and not be able to handle that kind of acute situation. Other people will rise and be able to handle it well. That's what an emergency response worker does. That's a totally different skill set from a chronic situation where you have to show up and do the day in, day out slog. So this is like emergency worker versus someone in an old people's home or working with a geriatric unit, where it's day in, day out, a sort of repetitive. We've got to keep this quality up. We've got to do the same thing over and over again. And I would say it's useful to celebrate the chronic too. The people who are good at that. Our culture tends to celebrate the acute. Why? Because it's way more Hollywood. It's way more Hollywood to have someone rush in, and heroically clamp down on the wrist and stop the blood from spurting, and that's just way more kind of exciting, and it's a big Hollywood moment. But there's a lot of stories to tell about the people who show up every day and do the more chronic stuff that's going to be required as we go through this. So, but in all storytelling, I would just say capture the detail, and I think Meredith said this authenticity. Don't let kind of corporate communications, stringent protocols get in the way of authenticity. So you might have to throw out the rule book a little bit. That's okay, as long as you are authentic, empathic, and honest with a lot of detail, like the whole 4 a.m, 17 cups of coffee, whatever those details are. Make sure you capture those too, because that's what makes human beings come alive to a story.
Right. So true. Debanjan from India asks, as an organization, how do we ensure we don't slip back into old habits?
Oh, this is such a good question. I'm a research analyst at Gartner. There's a lot of speculation about how much of the change that has been created by COVID-19 is going to endure and how much is going to be a one-time crisis-bound effort. And the discussions are ongoing. I think one thing executives and other leaders need to get ahead of is laying out some pre-COVID assumptions that they need to be deliberate about choosing what to do next. So that could be really, big stuff like supply chain design. You know, the assumption going in was lowest cost is the most important, and thus, if it's all in one country, that's okay. And I think, the diversification, supply chain diversification might be something that people start to focus on. But anyway, there's a bunch of these assumptions, assumptions around remote work. Well, for most of our employees, remote work will not work, and they all have to be in the office for us to be able to get high value work out the door, right? Examining those assumptions deliberately and taking a position deliberately is one of the ways to not backslide into old habits. Even if the choice is to say, actually, the way we were doing it before is what we choose to do, just making that choice deliberate as opposed to it being a kind of messy, by accident, no one really controlled it, backsliding. Really matters. So leaders at this isn't just for executives, but any leader of any team should be kind of examining deliberately now, getting ahead of it. What are some of the things that I thought were true before this happened that now I need to really question? And what is my position on those things? Maybe it's we go back to the way it was because it was just better anyway, but maybe it's we do a blending. Maybe it's we adopt a wholesale, totally new approach that before this we would have thought was impossible. But I think the key is examining where those assumptions are and being deliberate about what you're going to do next so that the accidental backslide doesn't occur.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, Maria from Italy, apart from the quality of communication, how important is the quantity of this communication from leaders?
So I think frequency is the thing. So that might be what Maria meant by quantity. Or she might just have meant, this overwhelming quantity that we're all getting. But I think frequency matters quite a lot. So the quality of the communication, I would rather it be simple and clear and honest and empathic, and nice and short. So lower quantity, but quite frequent. What you might find if you're managing teams remotely, or even if you're just trying to be a good team member, even if you don't manage anyone, is more frequent communication matters. So at the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about, newer employees. Imagine a situation where someone was just hired, in let's say early February in Europe, and they haven't had a chance to cement relationships in the workplace around the water cooler, over lunch, getting a coffee, right? None of that has happened. There's certain constituencies like those newer workers where the frequency of the communication might need to be much greater. And I don't mean just corporate communications like this is our position vis-a-vis the crisis. I mean individual communication. So leaders might have to probably should be upping their individual communication. And I think also the way that they communicate needs to change. So I think you can, really simplifying, any leader should be maybe managing their own life, but certainly managing their communications with their people in 3 buckets. And this is from a friend and colleague of mine, Warren Anderson, who works at Gartner. He manages his life with 3 buckets in this crisis. Bucket 1, my health. How am I doing? Because very similar to an airline situation when the flight attendants exhort us to put our masks on first and then help others. I can't be good to anyone else. I can't be a force for good if I'm not healthy. So how am I doing? How's my health and well-being, right? My mental well-being, my physical health. Second bucket, my family. Are they okay? Are the loved ones okay? Not least because they're right there. Like there isn't really a separation right now for your workforce and their families. My daughter is about 10 feet from me on the other side of this wall, and that's how most people are living. So how are they doing? If there's a problem there, it's probably creeping into the work. And then third bucket, how's the work going? And so checking in with those 3 things in that order, I think actually makes your workforce more efficient, not less efficient. So, resisting the urge to just get straight down to business and we're just going to keep on going and pretend nothing's happened and just focus on what we need to focus on. I know that's an urge for a lot of people, but I think it's probably more efficient to go through how are you doing? How is your family doing? And then get to the work because they're going to be distracted by it anyway. So that's in terms of the quantity of the communication, not a lot, but in terms of the frequency, I'd say quite frequent, especially for certain constituencies, like some people who are feeling isolated, maybe new workers. And in terms of what goes into that communication, a good tactic is, first, you and your health, second, the family, and third, work in that order.
Thank you, Mary. Those are great priorities to keep in mind, especially during the heart of this crisis. We want to thank you all for joining us. We send our best wishes to all of you for good health, for any of you who are ill or have experienced a loss. We have analysts who are creating new research every day to cover coronavirus and what it means for organizations to manage during time of disruption and sustain their organizations. We have actually created a collection of complimentary research, webinars, and videos. To access it, visit Gartner.com/en/coronavirus. Thank you and take good care.